The cheese knife was still on the board when her father stood and sold her. Roisin Madry felt the blade's edge against the heel of her palm. Cold, familiar, the same knife she had used to cut the steward's portion every evening for 6 years, and she did not lift it. The great room smelled of tallow and cooling mutton. The steward's fork rested against the rim of his plate. 3 gentlemen of the hunting party sat at the long table with their eyes on the wood grain, and not one of them looked at her. Her father spoke from the head of the table as though naming the price of a hound. "My daughter is 22, and the kennel does not pay its keep. She has a name and a face, and that is what a man pays for. Lord Severn has offered for her. The terms are settled. She goes to the Severn estate by the end of the month." The room held its breath. No one reached for wine. The candles burned without flicker, their flames small and upright as if the air itself had stopped moving. One of the gentlemen swallowed once, audibly, the sound thick and wet in the silence. Roisin's thumb found the slip-leads stitching in her apron pocket and pressed the seam until the thread marks left a pattern on her skin. She had been standing at the side table to cut cheese for the steward. She was still standing there. She had not been asked to sit. She had never been asked to sit. The steward cleared his throat without lifting his eyes. "The Severn estate, Lord Hadrian." The first gentleman's voice came low and flat. "Twice widowed." "Yes." Roisin set the knife down on the board with care, the blade parallel to the cheese board's edge. She did not look at her father. She did not look at the steward. She walked out of the great room into the yard, her boots finding the flagstones with the same measured pace she used when a bitch was whelping, and the kennel needed steadiness more than speed. The candles in the great room did not follow her. Through the eastern window, the shadows along the Strathmore tree line gathered toward the iron fence. Longer than the setting sun's angle allowed, longer than any shadow the Madry woods had ever thrown. She knelt in the straw at the back of Pen 4 and pressed both palms flat against the cold stone of the kennel wall. Her shoulders did not shake. Her jaw was locked. The 8 bitches in the pen padded over one by one and lay down in a half-circle around her. They had done this before, on the morning her mother died, 11 years ago when she came to the kennel because there was nowhere else to go. She did not lift her hands from the stone. She did not weep. She sat like that for a long time. The fire in the kennel yard was low. She did not look at it. Old Maeve, the senior bitch of Pen 4, leaned her gray muzzle against Roisin's knee and did not move it. The cold of the stone came up through Roisin's palms and into her wrists. She spoke aloud to the wall, once in a voice that did not carry past the pen. "I am 22, and I have been sold for the price of 48 hounds. Then she pressed both hands briefly against the broad head of old Maeve, stood, closed the gate of Pen 4 behind her, and began her evening round. She checked each pen. She filled each water. She did not hurry, and she did not stop. The hounds in the nearest pen were silent. The next morning, Roisin stood in the doorway of her father's study. He stood at the window with his back to her, his hands clasped behind him, the curtain cord between his fingers. "What price has been agreed?" she asked. He did not turn. She did not move from the threshold. After a long moment he spoke, still to the window, still with his back to her. "A father does not discuss his daughter's price with his daughter. It is settled. Pack what you will take. The Severn carriage comes on Friday." She stood motionless in the doorway, her jaw working once as though she meant to speak, then closing. Her fingers found the worn leather of her apron pocket. but did not pull the needle case free. Instead, she turned on her heel, the floorboards creaking under her weight, and walked back into the corridor without a word. Behind her, the study door swung inward on its hinges, her father's hand rising to meet it, pushing it closed with deliberate slowness. The latch caught with a soft, final click. The sound of it echoed in the hallway longer than it should. Through the study's eastern window, the Strathmore tree line was visible in the morning light. The iron fence along the boundary catching the low sun, older than the estate's current deed, older than the man at the window. That evening, Whitaker came across the kennel yard with a folded paper from the steward. His hands were steady. His eyes were not. He held the paper out to Roisin without speaking. She took it. She read it aloud, because reading it aloud was the only way to make it real. Dissolution of the Kennel Girl Post, the Friday of this month. The hounds to be sold or shot at the master's discretion. By order of the steward, by the master's hand. The paper creased along its original fold as her fingers found the line. Crease worn soft from the steward's pocket, from his hand, from the moment before he gave it to Whitaker. She did not fold it again. She held it at her side, the edge of it trembling against her thigh. Whitaker turned to the nearest hound at the fence, his voice low and careful. Easy. Easy now. The hound did not move. The pen was silent. I have been at this kennel 26 years. The hounds know the difference between a bad morning and the last one. Roisin pressed her thumb against the brass clasp of the needle case in her apron pocket until the clasp bit deep into the pad. A small, bright pain that anchored her to the yard, to the hounds, to the moment before everything ended. And what does a kennel master do when the hounds know? He tells the kennel girl. Whitaker turned once at the yard gate before he passed through it, his shoulders squared as though bearing weight. Because she is the one they listen to. He did not look at the paper in Roisin's hand. He did not look at the great room window. He walked back across the yard toward the tack room, his boots finding the same path they had found for a quarter century, each step deliberate, each step final. The cruel house to the south, the Severn estate, 200 miles away, where 2 young women had been buried under stones the Reverend would not bless, had reached the Madry kennel in a folded paper. Then she went to Pen 4 and began the night check. The shadows along the Strathmore tree line settled toward the iron fence as the last light went. Longer than the angle of the evening allowed, as though the eastern dark was leaning in. The morning after the dissolution paper, Roisin walked the boundary path east. 6 miles. The path was soft with overnight rain. She had walked it before, at 13, at 15, at 19, and had never crossed the low iron fence at its end. She did not cross it today. She stood at the fence with both hands at her sides. The forest on the Strathmore side was old growth, trees wider than 3 men with their arms joined. No undergrowth. The air between the trunks cold still in a way the Madry woods were not. The fence itself was cold under her hand when she rested it on the top rail. Colder than iron in morning air. Colder than the fence had been in any of the 9 years she had walked this boundary. She had been sold at the long table. The father had closed his study door. The dissolution paper was in her apron pocket. She turned and walked back. Twice in the soft mud beside the trail, she saw the print of a horse's hoof. The horse had walked the path that morning and walked it back, in her direction, at her pace. The hooves were unshod. She knelt to study the second print. The mud had not yet relaxed at the edges. Someone has walked this path at my pace, at my hour, and turned back. The same direction, the same weight. She spoke to the print, to the empty path, to no one she could see. She did not turn around to look for the horse. She stood. She walked back to the kennel. She did not tell Whitaker. The hoofprints were unshod on a boundary path that no working horse would be walked unshod, and the mud at the second print's edges had not yet relaxed, meaning the horse had passed minutes before Roisin, ahead of her, at her pace as if it knew her pace before she walked it. Whitaker found her in the tack room before first light. She had not slept. The dissolution paper lay on the bench in front of her, its creases softened by the warmth of her apron pocket. She sat with her hands on her knees and her eyes on the far wall, where the slip leads hung in order of length. He sat on the far end of the bench. He did not look at the paper. He spoke without preamble, his voice carrying the careful weight of a man who has rehearsed what he means to say and has decided to say it anyway. There were two before you. The first was Eleanor Marbeck. She was 20 when she went to the Severn estate. She was buried at 20 in the Severn churchyard. The Reverend at Severn would not write the cause into the register. You knew this. Roisin's voice was flat as the bench she sat on. I heard it in the kennel talk that passes between hunting estates. I was not certain enough to speak until last night. What was the second? Catherine Voss, 23. 18 months at the Severn estate. The burial stone has marks at the throat the Reverend chose not to record. That is a cruel house, Roisin. It is not a marriage. The tack room smelled of neatsfoot oil and old leather. Roisin ran her thumbnail along the stitching of the nearest slip lead where it hung against the wall, feeling each thread gap pass beneath the nail. The lead was sound. She had stitched it herself in February. The Strathmore boundary, the eastern land, that is not the same as the Severn lands. No. Whitaker set both hands flat on the bench and looked at the dissolution paper for the first time. The Strathmore name has held that eastern ground for 170 years, though the parish books call it 3 different names and will not cross-reference them one to another. The records do not speak to each other, Roisin. That is deliberate. And the iron fence. The iron fence marks a boundary that is not like the ones you know. It is older than property lines. She turned the needle case over once in her palm, the brass clasp warm from her pocket. You are going to tell me what is on the other side. Whitaker continued as though she had not spoken, his jaw set, his eyes fixed on the dissolution paper's ink. The master at Strathmore has held that land longer than any man's father can say. There are names older than the parish for what holds land that long and does not age in the holding of it. Vampire King is one. The iron fence is another. Cross neither without knowing what you are crossing. You are telling me to walk to the fence. I am telling you what is on the other side of it. The walking is yours. Roisin pressed the clasp of the needle case between her finger and thumb. The metal bit into both. 6 miles east. I have walked past the marker stone every morning since I was 11. You have walked past it. You have not crossed it. And if I do, then you will know what your father has kept from you by keeping you in the kennel. She held the case in her closed fist. The tack room was silent except for the breathing of hounds in the nearest pen. Slow, deep. The breathing of animals that knew the hand that fed them was still on the estate. She did not speak. Whitaker walked out of the tack room into the yard. The hounds in the nearest pen did not stir. That afternoon, Roisin walked the boundary path east a second time. 6 miles. The sky was low and gray, the kind of sky that sat on the treetops like a lid. She stopped at the low iron fence. The old growth on the Strathmore side was cold immortal in a way the Madry woods were not. A stillness no weather explained, the stillness of trees that had not been young in any living man's memory, trunks the color of slate, bark unbroken by any season's shedding. She did not cross the fence. She rested both hands on the top rail. The iron was cold in the way it had been cold the morning before. Colder than the afternoon allowed. Colder than any iron she had ever pressed her palm against. He refused to name the price. Her voice carried no further than the fence post. "The price is me." The forest beyond the rails did not shift. No wind moved the high branches. No small thing rustled the fern floor. The air between the trunks hung as it must have hung 100 years ago, untouched by season or breath. And Roisin understood in her chest that this stillness was not the stillness of waiting, but of a place that had already finished waiting. That had been finished waiting longer than her father's father had been alive. She turned. On the path back she saw again the print of an unshod horse's hoof, twice, at her pace, at her hour. The mud at the second print's edges had not yet relaxed. She knelt to study it. She ran her index finger along the print's outer edge the way she ran a finger along a hound's gum line, reading it, testing its depth, measuring what the shape meant against what she knew of weight and stride. The horse was heavy. The stride was unhurried. The prince went in her direction and came back, as though the rider had walked beside her and turned when she turned. She did not turn around. She stood and walked back to the kennel. The vampire king, whose land bordered the Madry estate to the east, had watched the kennel girl work for 9 years from the other side of the iron fence, though she had never heard him called that. Only Strathmore, the name on the eastern boundary. She did not tell Whitaker what she had seen. That evening, Whitaker read the dissolution paper aloud in the kennel. The 2 boys who worked under Roisin stood at the pen gate with their caps in their hands, the younger one shifting his weight from boot to boot. The first boy spoke before Whitaker had finished folding the paper. "What happens to the hounds? The paper says sold or shot at the master's discretion." Whitaker's voice was steady. His hands were not. "Can she stop it?" The second boy looked at Roisin. "She is the only one who can." Whitaker set the paper on the kennel post and turned to Roisin. "The Severn carriage comes at the 3rd hour on Friday. You have until then." "Until then for what, exactly?" Roisin stepped forward and lifted the paper from the post. Her eyes moved down the page until she found the clause. The kennel establishment and all hounds therein to be liquidated or destroyed as the new master sees fit. She read the words twice. "Until then, to decide whether the hounds die with your name on this paper or live with it somewhere else. The hounds will not die with my name on anything." She folded the paper back along its original crease, the motion deliberate, and slid it into her apron pocket, where it settled against the small leather needle case. "The hounds will not die at all." Bold words for a girl with no deed and no husband. Bold words from a man who has not been to the boundary fence in 6 years. She looked at him, and something in her look made him lower his chin. "I have walked it twice in 2 days. What have you walked?" The hounds had begun to pace and whine. Old Maeve at the front of pen 4, her ears pricked, sensing the shift in the air. Roisin turned to face the kennel post and pressed the flat of her palm against the weathered wood twice. A sharp, clear sound that cut through the yard. The pack stilled. The whining stopped. 48 hounds fell silent, their eyes fixed on her. The first kennel boy looked at the second. Neither spoke. Through the kennel yard's eastern gate, the Strathmore tree line was visible in the last light. The shadows along the fence line longer than the angle of the setting sun allowed, as though the eastern dark was leaning toward the Madry yard, gathering itself against the iron fence with the patience of something that had leaned there before, in another year, toward another kennel girl who had not been there to see it. Later, in the dark of the tack room, Whitaker came back. Roisin sat on the bench with the lantern low and the dissolution paper folded before her. "The Severn carriage will be at the western gate at the 3rd hour tomorrow." He did not sit. "I know. The dissolution takes effect at the same hour. The steward has the order." "I know that too." Whitaker leaned against the doorframe. "Vale Strathmore has had the eastern estate for 170 years. The brief says he has had a counter-offer in his coat for twice the Severn installment for 2 years. I do not know how a man holds a thing that long without acting on it. He has been waiting. For what? For me to walk to the fence." Whitaker's voice went thin the way it did when he spoke of the 2 Severn widows. "Then I have told you all I know, girl. The rest is yours to carry. You have told me a great deal more than all you know." She turned the needle case over in her palm without looking at it, her thumb finding the clasp by habit. "You have told me that a man I have never met has held a counter-offer for 2 years and has not once approached me, not once knocked on the kennel gate, not once sent a letter or a servant or a word through you. Would you have listened? I would have listened the way I listened to hoof prints in the mud, with my eyes open and my hand on the gum line." She set the case down on the bench. "I would have known what I was being told. And now? Now I know what I was not being told, which is worse." Whitaker stood in the doorway a moment longer. "I will be at the kennel at first light. Whatever you choose, I will be here. I will be." She knelt beside pen 4, where old Maeve lay on her side in the straw, the senior bitches breathing shallow and steady. Roisin ran her index finger along the inside of Maeve's lip, slow and deliberate, feeling for the pale gum line beneath the loose skin. The old dog's eye opened, amber in the lantern light, and did not close. "Then I will be ready." Her voice came out level as the gum line itself. Whitaker nodded once, the motion slow and final, and did not ask again. The shadows along the Strathmore fence line on the night before Friday were longer than the forest allowed, longer than the angle of any moon or any lamp could throw them. The Vampire King's shadows had been gathering toward the Madry boundary since dusk, and now they lay against the iron fence like something breathing. 3 in the morning in the kennel, the night before Friday. The lantern at the kennel post was low, its flame no larger than a fingertip. The tack room smelled of leather oil and meal and the sharp copper scent of old hinge work. Roisin sat on the bench with the leather needle case open on her lap. She ran her index finger along the row of needles. 12 fine silk, 3 coarse, 2 curved, slowly, not stopping at any one. The motion was the motion she used to check the case before a difficult whelping, methodical, unhurried, the finger reading the metal the way the eye reads a page. She closed the case, opened it, closed it again. She pressed her thumb against the brass clasp until the clasp left a square mark on the pad of her thumb. She held the case against her sternum with the brass clasp biting through her shirt. She did not move it. The first wife was 20. The second was 23. I am 22. Her voice did not carry past the tack room door. The lantern did not answer. The hounds in the nearest pen were quiet. Not the quiet of sleep, but the quiet of animals who knew the difference between a woman sitting still and a woman sitting still before something changed. She held the case against her sternum for a long time. Her breathing came through her mouth because her nose had closed. Her eyes burned, but she did not wipe them. The cold of the tack room came up through the bench and into the backs of her thighs. She did not move. The boundary has been named. She lowered the case. She laid it on the bench. She stood. She went to pen 4 and began the night check. She did not sleep. At first light, she walked the line. Every pen counted, every water level checked, every hound accounted for with the steady competence of a woman who had done this work since she was 11 and would do it until someone tore it from her hands. The hour before first light. Roisin walked the boundary path east one more time. 6 miles in the dark. The earth was soft underfoot. The smell of turned mud and wet fern also rising around her boots with every step. She stopped at the iron fence. She rested both hands on the top rail. The fence was cold. Colder than iron in night air. Colder than the fence had been in any of the 9 years she had walked this boundary. The cold went through her palms and up into her wrists, the way the cold of the kennel wall had gone through her the night her father made the announcement. The forest on the Strathmore side breathed once, a slow exhale from the old growth. No wind. The trees not moving, the air moving. The shadows along the fence line on the Strathmore side settled and did not move again. She stood at the fence for half an hour. The forest did not move again. There was no horse. She had been sold at the long table. The dissolution paper was in her apron pocket. The price her father refused to name was the answer she did not yet have. But the boundary had been named. And the rider who walked her pace at her hour had not crossed the fence either. She walked back to the kennel. The eastern sky was beginning to gray. The iron fence behind her held its cold, colder than any season she had known it. And the exhale from the old growth on the Strathmore side had moved the air without moving a single branch, the way an immortal presence moves through a room without displacing the dust. Roisin was at the kennel gate at first light when she heard the carriage on the western road. The sound of it was the sound of a heavy vehicle on wet mud. Iron-rimmed wheels grinding stone and clay, the whip crack of a coachman's signal carrying across the low fields. The Severn carriage, 200 miles south, arriving at the 3rd hour. She had not slept. She had walked the line. The 48 hounds were fed and watered. Old Maeve was in pen 4 with the morning's ration. Whitaker arrived at the kennel gate 2 minutes after the carriage sound reached them. His boots were muddy to the ankle. His jaw was set the way it set before a difficult whelping. That is the Severn carriage on the western road. Yes. The great room. The steward will have the contract on the table by the 3rd hour. Then I will be in the great room at the 3rd hour. You are certain of this, girl? She drew the small leather needle case from her apron pocket and pressed her thumb against the brass clasp until it left a square mark on the pad. The metal was cold. She held it there for a breath longer than necessary, then turned the case over once in her palm and slipped it back into the pocket. I am certain. The hounds know when a handler is afraid. You are not afraid. That is worse. Whitaker's voice was rough at the edges. I am not afraid because I have already lost the kennel in my mind. What I have not lost is the record of what 48 hounds and 9 years of work are worth. That is what I am carrying into the great room. And the eastern boundary? The rider on the path? I did not cross the fence. I will not cross the fence. If the boundary comes to me, it comes on its own terms. She straightened the apron across her hips, the motion deliberate, the way she straightened the slip leads before a morning walk. But I will not pretend I did not see the hoof prints. Whitaker nodded once, the motion slow and final, and did not ask again. She walked across the yard toward the great room. She did not look back at the kennel. She did not need to. She knew what was in every pen. As Roisin walked the yard toward the great room, the shadows along the Strathmore tree line, visible through the eastern gate, shifted once as though something on the far side of the iron fence had turned and begun to move toward the Madry estate. Roisin entered the great room. Lord Hadrian Severn was already there, 46 years old, standing at the head of the table beside the locked oak chest. His understeward stood at the window. The Madry steward stood at the door. The Madry father stood at the far end of the room near the curtained eastern window. The contract was on the table, open. The pen was beside it. Severn did not greet Roisin. He addressed the Madry father. The contract is in order. The first installment is in the chest. Your steward has reviewed the terms. He has. The Madry father did not look at Roisin. The Madry steward cleared his throat and stepped forward. The terms are as stated, sir. The settlement is secured against the Severn estate holdings, and the clause regarding the household designation is binding upon signature. Then we are ready to sign. Severn placed one hand flat on the table beside the contract. The Madry father's hand moved toward the pen, hesitated, then closed around it. Roisin stood at the door of the great room and did not move. Her eyes traveled across the open page. The clause that read, "The female servant designated as kennel girl of the eastern domain, being of sound body and unmarried status, shall pass into the wardship and matrimonial contract of the aforementioned Lord Hadrian Severn." The words had no name in them. They had never had a name in them. The shadows in the eastern corner of the great room, the corner nearest the Strathmore boundary, were slightly longer than the morning light through the windows should produce. Then they moved. The Madry father's hand was on the pen. The contract was unsigned. The chest was open. Roisin stared at the clause, and then at a hand on the table that had not been there a moment before. Pale nails, knuckles that did not show the cold of the morning, the cuff fallen back 2 inches to reveal a wrist older than the great room. The wrist of something that had not aged in the manner the room had aged. She had not seen him enter. The steward at the door had not opened it. The vampire king who had watched the Madry kennel from the eastern side of the iron fence for 9 years walked into the great room of the Madry estate without using the door. The steward at the door did not see him pass. His coat was dry after 6 miles of wet mud road on a wet morning. His shadow on the wall behind him fell slightly shorter than his height required. Every man at the table turned to Vale Strathmore. Vale did not turn to Roisin. He did not look at her face. He set a banker's draft on the table beside the contract, a single sheet, the figure written in a clear hand, and he did not speak yet. "I am in the room." Roisin's voice cut across the silence before she had decided to speak. Every man at the table turned to her. Vale did not. He saw her. She understood this without being able to say how he understood it, and he did not look at her face. She walked the length of the room to the contract. She read the clause Vielle had written in her name on her own line. A new clause, added in his hand to the body of the document, requiring the named daughter's signature on her own line as condition of the agreement. Her hand was steady when she picked up the pen. Her eyes burned after she set it down. She pressed her thumb against the brass clasp of the needle case in her apron pocket until the clasp bit. Then she extended her hand across the table, palm up, toward Vale Strathmore. He did not take it. He inclined his head. He did not look at her face until she had extended the hand. Then he looked. His eyes were dark amber held against the morning light, and the pupils did not narrow in the brightness. Vale spoke for the first time in the great room. He addressed Severn. He did not raise his voice. The named daughter has signed on her own line. The clause is in the document. I am here to offer twice the Severn installment, paid in gold, on the table now. The agreement is already in order. Severn's voice was cold courtesy and nothing else. The agreement does not have her signature on her own line. Mine does. I am offering twice the installment, in gold, redeemable at sight, on the named day. You cannot match it. Severn's teeth locked together. His fingers moved to the brass handles of the oak chest with the deliberate slowness of a man who had already calculated the cost of refusal. I withdraw. The chest is yours to close. Severn closed the chest with a soft, final click. His understeward stepped forward without being summoned, gathering the dissolution papers from the table's edge into a leather folio. Severn did not look at Roisin where she stood near the hearth. He turned toward the door. The Madry steward pulled the great room door open without a word, and Severn passed through without turning his head. Vale read aloud from the document, his voice carrying to the walls. The named daughter signs on her own line, of her own person, of her own consent. The Severn agreement is dissolved. The witnesses to the original announcement will sign as witnesses to its undoing. The steward stepped forward first, his weathered hand reaching for the pen with the certainty of a man who had waited 3 days to make this gesture. The 3 gentlemen who had been at the long table the night of the announcement were brought forward from the corridor, the eldest in a gray waistcoat, the second in riding boots still dusty from the morning, the third younger than the others, his collar still creased from travel. I am signing first. I was first to hear it announced. I am first to witness its undoing. The steward's signature was bold and deliberate. I heard it said at the long table, I will sign. The first gentleman took the pen. The second gentleman turned to the third. She has a line on her own name. I did not know a contract could be written that way. It can now. The shadow Vale cast on the great room wall when the lamp swept past him was slightly shorter than his height required. The lamp did not reach as far behind him as it should. The parish reverend, summoned that morning, stood at the filing table. The Madry steward read the price from the body of the document, while the Madry father stood at the head of the room. He did not look at Roisin while it was read. She did not look at him. The price agreed and paid, twice the Severn installment, in gold, redeemable at sight, on the named day. The price is named. The record holds it. The Reverend dipped his pen and wrote in the parish register in a careful hand. He did not look up from the page. The steward nodded once. The entry is made, witnessed and recorded. The Madry father, at the head of the room, did not speak. The steward did not look at him. The Reverend did not look at him. The price was in the record. Vale addressed Roisin for the first time directly, after the Reverend had closed the register and the steward had stepped back. His voice did not rise above the register of a man standing close. I paid for what I knew you to be worth. The doubling is what your father had to be shown. You were the rider on the boundary path. It was not a question. I have held that fence for 170 years. I am not a 46-year-old husband. I am the vampire king of the Eastern Domain, and I have watched you work. The price is what I named, because that is what the work is worth. She looked at his wrist where the cuff had fallen back from the banker's draft. The skin there was pale as paper, unmarked by any vein. She looked at his eyes, dark amber held against the morning light. The pupils did not narrow in the brightness. She did not look away. You walked the boundary at my pace, at my hour. You knew my pace before I walked it. I knew your pace the year you were 13 and walked the line at first light in the rain. I did not know your name until you spoke it to the empty path 3 days ago. The morning light from the eastern window fell across his hand on the banker's draft without warming it. And you waited. I waited for the hand. You extended it. I did not take it. You inclined your head. The signature was the offer. The hand is yours to keep. The dissolution paper was void by Vale's signature on the joint agreement. The 48 hounds were loaded into Strathmore wagons by the Strathmore men on the Saturday morning. Whitaker oversaw the loading. Roisin stood at the gate of Pen 4 with old Maeve at her knee. The bitch did not load with the others. Whitaker lifted her himself and set her in the front wagon on a folded blanket. She is too old to ride loose. She rides with the master, as did her mistress in time. His voice carried across the yard, loud enough for the Madry father to hear from the great room window. The Strathmore man nodded and shifted the blanket's edge to make room. Whitaker climbed up beside old Maeve, his hand steady on the wagon's rim, and settled himself with a small grunt. At the great room window, the Madry father's silhouette stiffened. His hand rose to the curtain cord and drew it closed with a sharp pull that rattled the rings. She whelped 12 in this kennel. She rides in front. Whitaker's jaw was set. Front wagon, understood. The Strathmore man gathered the reins. Whitaker turned to the driver. The gate's yours to close. I won't be coming back through it. Roisin stood at the gate of Pen 4 until the last wagon had passed through the yard gate. Then she walked to the front wagon. She did not look at the great room window. She did not look at the eastern boundary. She looked at old Maeve on the folded blanket in the front wagon, gray muzzle on gray paws. The same bitch who had lain down in a half-circle around her in Pen 4 the night the announcement was made. Vale Strathmore, mounted on a dark horse at the head of the Strathmore wagons, did not look back at the Madry estate. The horse's hooves were unshod on the wet road. The Strathmore wagons moved east. The kennel yard was empty. The gate stood open behind them. The unshod horse at the head of the wagons, the same unshod print Roisin had knelt to study twice on the boundary path, moved east toward the iron fence without sound, without effort, as though the road was already the road it was always going to be.